The air in the boardroom was thick with the scent of polished mahogany and the stench of pure, unearned arrogance. "You're an anchor, Thorne. Excess weight on a yacht that needs to fly." Julian Sterling had sneered, his hand already reaching for the security button, not to protect himself, but to emphasize the finality of my public execution. I felt the heat rising in my face, not from shame, but from the sudden, chilling clarity of a truth I had always suspected. Entitlement is a weakness, and I had just been given a detailed map of his. I'm Cassandra Thorne, and in the history of Athel Corp, Julian's mistake in firing me on that Tuesday afternoon would go down not merely as an HR blunder, but as the $800 million precursor to his ultimate downfall. I stood up slowly, calmly gathering the single box of my life, maintaining eye contact as I committed the petty, triumphant smirk on his face to memory. He thought he was severing a tie. He was actually handing me the wire cutters to his entire empire. That box didn't contain my possessions, it contained the ashes of my old loyalty, ready to fuel a far more devastating fire. For 15 years, I had poured my intellect and my entire adult life into Athel Corp. I started in the mailroom, worked my way through night classes, and eventually became the head of strategic operations, a title that meant I was the quiet engine ensuring Julian's father, Robert Sterling, the actual CEO, never had to worry about the finer points of the company's survival. I knew the company's DNA better than its founder's son. I knew the cracks in the foundation, the financial vulnerabilities, and the specific regulatory loopholes that kept us afloat in lean years. But Julian, fresh out of an overpriced, irrelevant business school and propelled by a sense of dynastic destiny, saw competence as a threat and dedication as a mark of the meek. What he didn't know was that for the last 2 years, I had been meticulously building a proprietary financial modeling system, Project Chimera, a system designed to stabilize a volatile, undisclosed asset portfolio worth close to $1 billion. That asset portfolio, the one I alone was managing, was the ticking bomb nestled beneath Athel Corp's impressive stock price. It was a legacy of risky bets made by Robert Sterling years ago, bets that now required Chimera's sophisticated algorithms to keep from imploding. Julian's abrupt decision to dismiss me was born of a simplistic desire to put his own crony in my seat, a man who spoke the trendy jargon of his cohort, but who possessed absolutely none of my foundational knowledge. Julian assumed Chimera was just a complex spreadsheet, easily handed off. He had no idea that the system was locked down with biometric security linked only to my thumbprint and retinal scan, a precaution I had taken precisely because I never trusted the Sterling family's handling of the true value of the company. As I walked out, I didn't just take my laptop, I took the key to the castle's most critical hidden chamber, leaving Julian to inherit a crisis he wasn't even aware existed. My immediate next step was a pilgrimage back to the small, one-bedroom apartment I still owned, a deliberate vestige of my humble past that kept me grounded. I didn't cry. Tears were a luxury reserved for the innocent, and I had just become a warrior. The severance check they offered, a paltry 6-month salary, was an insult that merely served to crystallize my resolve. I needed capital, but more importantly, I needed operational silence. Over the next 30 days, I liquidated every non-essential asset, sold the small investment portfolio I had built, and pulled every single cent into a discreet international trust. My goal was not simply to become wealthy, it was to become an unassailable financial force, a shadow entity with one purpose: to dismantle Athel Corp and personally ruin Julian Sterling. I spent endless hours studying their internal legal documents, focusing on the specific clause in my employment contract that Julian's arrogance had caused him to violate, a detail I knew would soon give me disproportionate leverage. My first acquisition was a defunct offshore shell company specializing in distressed asset management. I renamed it Nemesis Holdings. The irony of the name was a private joke, a source of grim satisfaction. I established 2 key operational teams,
one composed of elite, discreet cybersecurity experts, and another of sharp, ruthless corporate lawyers who specialized in hostile takeovers. My instruction to them was simple: find the weak points, expose the rot, and buy the company piece by legal piece. The true brilliance of my plan lay in the fact that every action I would take was perfectly legal, leveraging the very opaque, complex financial structures that Robert Sterling had spent decades building. I was using their own tools against them. Meanwhile, Julian was likely celebrating his executive move, oblivious to the fact that his arrogant mistake had provided me not just the motivation, but the vital 5-week head start I needed to prepare the ambush that would cost him everything.
Room. The dip was marginal, but the damage to investor confidence was palpable. I ensured that key financial journalists, through untraceable sources, received carefully curated, legally compliant data highlighting the disastrous, slow-burn financial bleeding from the very asset portfolio I had once managed. The leaks never named me or Nemesis Holdings. They simply amplified the inconvenient, painful truth of Ethel's internal instability. This wasn't just about money, it was about reputation, the fragile scaffolding that held the entire Sterling illusion together. The pressure mounted as the Viridian deal remained deadlocked. I had calculated Julian's moves with chilling accuracy. He would try to buy his way out. He authorized a massive stock buyback, desperately trying to stabilize the share price and signal strength. This was exactly what I needed. Every dollar he used to prop up the stock was a dollar he couldn't use to fight me elsewhere. Nemesis Holdings, through a network of dozens of anonymized brokerages, began shorting Ethel stock. It was a calculated, enormous gamble, but I had the insider knowledge, the ace up my sleeve, that no one else did. The true, impending crisis of that billion-dollar asset portfolio, which was now dangerously close to a catastrophic collapse without Project Chimera's active management. The tension in my chest was a constant, dull ache, but it was overshadowed by the bitter satisfaction of watching Julian slowly tighten the noose around his own company. I remembered a cold winter evening 20 years prior. My father, a brilliant but unassuming engineer, had brought home a bottle of cheap champagne, celebrating what he thought was a guaranteed partnership at the then-fledgling Ethel Corp. Robert Sterling, Julian's father, had shaken his hand and promised him the world. 6 months later, Robert had leveraged my father's proprietary designs, pushed him out with a minimal settlement, and claimed sole credit, setting the trajectory for Ethel's explosive growth. The revenge I was executing was not merely for my firing, it was the final, devastating payment on a 2-decade-old debt of betrayal and theft. My hatred for Julian was simply a proxy for the deeper, more profound resentment for his father, a man who built his dynasty on the backs of better men. This multi-generational theft required a multi-generational retribution, perfectly timed for when the original architect was too weak to fight. Julian, now visibly stressed and desperate, finally did what I anticipated. He called an emergency meeting with the board of directors to demand a massive, risky debt issuance to finance a direct, highly leveraged offer for Viridian Dynamics, bypassing the legal block. This was the moment for the reveal. My legal team, operating in the shadows, delivered a sealed packet to the board just hours before the meeting. The contents were not a threat, but a meticulously organized dossier detailing Julian's $800 million mistake, the capital he had quietly funneled into a vanity project, a failed venture that was now a total write-off, a financial black hole he had desperately tried to conceal from his father. This was the true vulnerability, the crime that eroded the last shred of confidence in his leadership. The suspense in that hour before the meeting, knowing the bomb had been placed and the fuse lit, was almost unbearable. The dossier hit the board like a physical blow.
The debt issuance proposal was immediately shelved. Julian was now fighting to save his job, not to secure an acquisition. He tried to discredit the documents, claiming they were fabricated and part of a hostile attack. This provided my window. Using an encrypted anonymous email address I'd established years ago, I sent Julian a single chilling message. Remember the anchor, Julian? The weight is back, and it's dragging your yacht to the bottom. It's Cassandra. The psychological impact was immediate. I saw the news footage later that day, Julian leaving the corporate headquarters, his face pale and drawn, the cocky arrogance replaced by a hunted look of terror. The realization that the quiet, competent woman he had humiliated was now the invisible, implacable enemy closing in on his family's legacy was a delicious, heady validation of my years of painstaking preparation. The next 48 hours were a frenzy of corporate warfare. Julian scrambled to find a white knight, a friendly investor who could infuse enough capital to fight off the mounting short selling and the toxic internal press. I anticipated every move, having studied Robert Sterling's favorite network. For every door Julian knocked on, Nemesis Holdings had already sent a subtle, damning financial warning about Ethel's undisclosed liabilities. I leveraged a crucial relationship with a retired board member, an old colleague of my father's, who had always harbored a quiet resentment for Robert. I promised him not riches, but the restoration of the company's original ethical mission. He delivered the final critical votes I needed on the board, the silent coup. The emotional pressure of maintaining this facade of cold, relentless competence, while my heart hammered with a raw, vengeful joy, was almost overwhelming. The emergency shareholder meeting was called to address the leadership crisis and the escalating financial instability. It was a formality, but I ensured it became a spectacle. I didn't attend in person. I appeared via secure, anonymous video link. My voice digitally modulated to be low, calm, and utterly commanding. Julian, gaunt and sweating, tried to present his defense. My presentation followed, a 20-minute, ruthlessly factual exposition that systematically dismantled Ethel Corp's financials, exposing the full, calculated truth of his waste and mismanagement. I unveiled the documents proving the $800 million loss, tracing the funds from Ethel's coffers into his phantom project and back into his own offshore accounts. The room was silent. Then a shocked, furious murmur rose like a storm. The vote was a landslide, a humiliating public repudiation of the Sterling name. The final resolution passed, stripping Julian of his executive power and placing Ethel Corp under the immediate interim control of Nemesis Holdings. The company was officially mine. I watched the live feed as Julian was escorted from the building by the very security team he had used to dismiss me. It was the perfect, symmetrical closure. I had not only taken his company, I had taken his pride, his inheritance, and his future. The phone on my desk rang. It was my lead lawyer, offering congratulations. I thanked him, but the moment of triumph felt strange, hollowed by the sheer weight of what I had sacrificed to achieve it. The decades of isolation,
Manufactured persona, the cold, calculating mindset, the victory was undeniable. Yet, it left a bitter aftertaste on my tongue. The debt was paid, but the ledger of my life felt impossibly unbalanced. I was in my war room, preparing to issue my first statement as the effective CEO of Ethel Corp, the screens flashing with market congratulation and news headlines, when the red emergency signal flashed on my dedicated internal security monitor. Julian had just been admitted to a high-security wing of the building. My security team confirmed he was with a heavily guarded older man, a man I instantly recognized from 20-year-old photographs, Robert Sterling. Robert, the true patriarch, the original villain of the story, was supposed to be incapacitated, recovering from a major stroke miles away. I felt a surge of cold dread, a sudden sickening realization that I might have underestimated the old lion, that my victory might have been a lure. Robert was too astute, too cunning to surrender so easily. The camera feed flickered on a small, isolated screen I hadn't known existed, showing Robert, frail but with steel in his eyes, holding a thick manila envelope. "You've won, Cassandra." His voice, weak but resonating, echoed through the secure line. "But the story you think you finished is still being written." He tapped the envelope. "You thought you were destroying the company my father built, but you were only playing the part I wrote for you. I knew Julian was incompetent. I saw this coming. This company was destined to fail under his hand." My breath hitched, my mind racing. A trap? A secret poison pill? I stared at the envelope, my victory dissolving in a cold sweat of suspense. What final, devastating trick could the old man possibly hold that could overturn a legally binding shareholder vote? Robert's next words delivered the near-ending cliff-style twist that shattered my entire narrative. "What you are holding is not a poison pill, Cassandra. It is my final will and testament, a public confession detailing the exact, methodical theft of your father's intellectual property 2 decades ago. I foresaw your move, not to stop it, but to validate it. I was testing Julian to prove he couldn't hold what he didn't earn. You, Cassandra, earned it. Your revenge is justified, and you have, in fact, saved the company." He let the envelope fall onto the desk between him and his disgraced son. The ultimate twist. The man I spent 2 decades hating had, in his own twisted final act, validated my entire mission. Not by fighting me, but by surrendering his moral authority and handing me the keys to his kingdom. Fulfilling my revenge, but robbing me of the final anticipated confrontation. The powerful final emotional payoff wasn't the sound of the gavel or the transfer of stock. It was the quiet, hollow silence of my war room after Robert Sterling disconnected. My entire life had been defined by a cold, righteous hatred, a singular drive to reclaim my family's honor. Now the company was mine. The man I hated had confessed and validated my path, and I was left with a dizzying sense of emptiness. I had expected a struggle, a brutal, satisfying battle of wits to the death, but I received a weary, guilt-ridden gift. I leaned back in my chair, the vastness of the corporate empire I now controlled feeling like a crushing weight, not a trophy. The hatred, so long my faithful companion, finally receded, replaced by a profound, sobering understanding of the true cost of betrayal and the even heavier responsibility of genuine power. The revenge was complete, but the work, the building of an ethical, honorable Ethiel Corp, was only just beginning. I stepped into the executive suite the next morning, no longer an anchor, but the unquestioned captain. Julian Sterling was gone, having resigned and disappeared from public life. The scent of mahogany was still there, but now it felt like my air, my domain. My journey hadn't been about the $800 million. That was just the measure of Julian's folly. It was about the 2 decades of stolen opportunity, the years of silent, burning injustice. My revenge had been a flawless, calculated surgical strike, a perfect execution of financial strategy fueled by emotional fire. But as I sat in the CEO's chair, the city skyline spread out before me, I knew the real victory wasn't in the taking, but in the rebuilding. A silent promise to my father that the legacy he built on integrity would finally be restored. The company's name remained Ethiel Corp, but its mission was now mine. My focus shifted from destruction to meticulous ethical construction. I immediately leveraged the Viridian Dynamics IP, which I finally acquired at a fair, non-coercive price, to launch the new line of products Julian desperately sought. The stock price, buoyed by the stability and the public cleansing of the Sterling corruption, soared. The market applauded the new transparent leadership. But every decision I made was filtered through a simple, single question. Would my father be proud? The emotional intensity that once drove my revenge now channeled into an unwavering commitment to integrity. The hatred was gone, replaced by a cold, professional determination to prove that the best revenge is not just winning, but winning honorably, permanently. I personally oversaw the dismantling of Julian's frivolous ventures, recouping the bulk of the $800 million loss he had incurred, a feat that cemented my status among the major shareholders. This recovery was a quiet, practical victory,
less dramatic than the boardroom coup, but far more satisfying. The emotional payoff was no longer a rush of spite, but a steady, profound sense of justice achieved. I had used my intellect to destroy a corrupt empire, and now I would use it to build a better one. The constant what happens next suspense that had characterized my life for 20 years was finally replaced by the calm, predictable rhythm of purposeful work. I realized then that my revenge was merely the necessary prologue, the dark chapter that had to be closed before the true story of Ethel Corp could finally begin. My first public address as CEO was not a victory lap, but a sober commitment to transparency and ethical governance. I addressed the internal struggles, the mistakes of the past, without directly naming the Sterlings, allowing the media to fill in the blanks. This restraint
Deliberate. I wanted the focus to be on the future, not the past. The tension had shifted from personal conflict to corporate responsibility. I spent my days in deep discussions with the engineering and compliance teams, areas Julian had ignored, focusing on the actual human talent that Robert Sterling had once pushed aside. The company was no longer a vessel for dynastic arrogance. It was a complex machine that needed careful, expert maintenance, a mission I was uniquely qualified to lead. I found myself revisiting the old blueprints my father had created, the original intellectual property that had been stolen. I sanctioned a project to officially recognize and remunerate my father's estate for the original work, a simple act of justice that cost the company very little, but meant everything to me. It was a private moment of deep emotional closure. The strong mid-story tension hooks that defined my climb, the stock shorts, the legal blockades, the covert leaks, were now part of the company's past, a dark history I was actively sanitizing. The narrative of my life had flipped. I had gone from the vengeful orphan to the corporate savior, a transformation I had orchestrated with relentless, cold-blooded precision. One evening, my former team, the ones Julian had immediately tried to replace, organized a small, quiet celebration. It was a testament to the loyalty I had built over 15 years, a loyalty Julian had carelessly discarded. In that moment, surrounded by competent, dedicated people who genuinely believed in me, I felt a connection I hadn't allowed myself in 2 decades. The emotional pressure that had fueled my isolation began to dissipate. I realized the true power I held wasn't in the stock shares or the board votes, but in the trust of the people who worked beside me. The suspense of the great revenge plot was over. The new suspense was the challenge of ethical leadership. I used my intimate knowledge of the company's vulnerabilities not to destroy, but to fortify. I implemented Project Chimera, the financial modeling system Julian never understood, not just for the billion-dollar portfolio, but for the entire company's risk management. It was a beautiful, elegant machine I had built, designed to ensure stability and guard against the kind of catastrophic failure that Julian had narrowly avoided. The system was my legacy, and now it was protecting my company. The irony was palpable. The tool I created to wage war was now the one ensuring peace. I faced down 2 immediate shareholder lawsuits filed by Julian's remaining loyalists, both of which were dismissed instantly due to the airtight legal strategy Nemesis Holdings had employed. The lawsuits were the last dying gasps of the old regime, and my swift, decisive countermoves reinforced the market's belief in my unassailable position. There were no more strong mid-story tension hooks to manufacture. The drama was real, but it was now on my terms. I maintained my cool, cinematic demeanor in public, a figure of calm, powerful authority. But in private, I allowed myself a small, satisfied smile.
The humiliation Julian intended for me had been returned tenfold. The company's next earnings report was the final nail in the coffin of the Sterling era. Adel Corp posted its highest ever profit margin, directly attributable to the cost-cutting measures, risk management systems, and the new product line I had implemented. The $800 million loss was a distant memory, a footnote in the company's remarkable turnaround. The powerful, final emotional payoff of my journey was not in taking something, but in turning something broken into something magnificent. I was no longer a woman consumed by vengeance, but a CEO driven by a vision. The silence in the boardroom was no longer the sound of shattering glass, but the quiet hum of immense controlled power. I initiated an internal project to digitize and archive all of Robert Sterling's personal files, a task that required sifting through decades of his correspondence. I discovered a series of old handwritten letters to his father, revealing a deep, crippling insecurity and a profound fear of failure, a fear that drove his original betrayal of my father and his ultimate desperate test of Julian. This revelation completed the picture. The villains in my story were not just greedy, they were tragically flawed, driven by a cycle of fear and ambition. This understanding offered a final, unexpected layer of peace, transforming my hatred into a quiet, solemn empathy. I restructured the entire board, appointing the old honorable colleague of my father's as the new chairman. This symbolic act was the true restoration of Adel Corp's original integrity. The boardroom, once the stage for my humiliation and later my coup, was now a place of collaborative, ethical governance. I had designed the perfect revenge, a masterpiece of financial engineering and psychological warfare. But I had also achieved something greater, redemption for the institution itself. The revenge was a means, not an end. The company, once poisoned by entitlement, was now a monument to competence and justice. The media never truly uncovered the full personal story. They saw a brilliant, cold-blooded executive who executed a perfect hostile takeover. They wrote about the financial drama, the stunning corporate reversal, the $800 million mistake that opened the door. But they missed the heart of the story. The 10-year-old girl hiding under the table, the orphaned student meticulously gathering knowledge, the woman who waited 20 decades for the perfect moment. The suspense was over, the emotional pressure released. I had earned the chair not by birthright or force, but by the sheer, undeniable superiority of my intelligence and my unyielding commitment to justice. I walked the company halls now not as an invisible employee, but as the visible, commanding force. The employees saw a leader, not a pawn. The legacy of betrayal was finally overwritten by the legacy of merit. The constant "what happens next" I once endured had transformed into the powerful assurance of my own control. The emotional journey from raw, agonizing hatred to this final, quiet sense of balance was the true reward. I had not destroyed Adel Corp. I had saved it from itself, completing my revenge by becoming the one thing Julian Sterling could never be: indispensable. My final act in the great Sterling saga was dealing with Robert's last will. It designated a vast sum to a foundation dedicated to ethical business practices and mentorship, a final silent penance. His letter to me, included in the envelope, simply read, "Use it well. The future of Adel Corp belongs to the competence you represent, not the name I gave it." The note was a final, stunning act of capitulation, stripping my victory of its malice and leaving only the pure, unsullied form of achieved justice. The man I had sworn to destroy had in the end given me his blessing, a powerful, unexpected twist that redefined the entire meaning of my revenge. The final, decisive moment came not in a legal document, but in the complete, soul-cleansing release of my need for vengeance. The hatred was gone. The emotional pressure, which had been a constant companion for 2 decades, finally lifted, leaving me lighter, more focused, and wholly dedicated to the monumental task of leading a multi-billion-dollar corporation. The powerful final emotional payoff was the ability to look at my father's framed photograph on my new executive desk and know without a shadow of a doubt that the debt had been paid in full, and that his integrity, finally and permanently, outlived their greed. If you liked this video and want more stories, please like, subscribe, and support the channel. Your support keeps these stories alive.